So this time you sent us into some really interesting territory, the world of Plutarch. Now, for someone with a philosophical mind like you, diving into a thinker who really wrestled with Plato like that, I think offers a very special kind of reward. But the question is, what makes Plutarch, as a philosopher, so compelling?
Yeah, Plutarch, active in the 1st and early 2nd century CE, is widely known, of course, for his parallel lives. But his real significance, at least for us as philosophers, lies in his very distinctive project of engaging with Plato's entire philosophical legacy.
Right.
He wasn't just, summarizing or picking out favorite bits. He really wanted to create a coherent and importantly, a defensible philosophical system from Plato's works. What's remarkable is that he had a deep respect for both the skeptical inquiring elements in Plato, so that sort of, Socratic tentativeness, as well as the doctrines that Plato seemed to endorse.
So it wasn't just about accepting certain teachings. It was
Yeah.
about that process of questioning.
Absolutely. And this is where he starts to diverge from some of his predecessors. He really saw that dynamism in Plato, the back and forth between the open-ended search for truth and then these very specific pronouncements that you find in dialogues like the Timaeus.
All right.
And actually, speaking of the Timaeus, this is really where his approach becomes, I think, most fascinating for a philosopher. Unlike some other Platonists before him, Plutarch was totally committed to this dialogue, and he considered it central to understanding Plato's core philosophical commitments, And his very literal reading of the Timaeus really profoundly shaped his entire interpretation of Plato's system.
Literal interpretation.
Yeah.
For a philosopher engaging with Plato, that sounds like it could either be a rabbit hole of endless problems or just a treasure trove of unique insights. What did that actually mean for him?
Yeah, for Plutarch, taking the Timaeus literally meant accepting that the cosmos had an actual beginning in time.
Okay.
And that it originated from 2 fundamental principles, and these principles are eternal. So first you have the divine craftsman. That's, the God who's responsible for order, for the cosmos itself, and for the identity of all things. And then second, you have something called the indefinite dyad, which is this concept rooted in Pythagorean thought. It's also associated with Plato's student, Speusippus. And for Plutarch, this dyad represents a kind of pre-creation disorder.
Okay.
Think of it like the chaotic canvas before the artist starts to work.
So God is that ultimate source of form and order. And then you have this dyad, which is the formless, chaotic kind of substrate.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's a pretty strong dualism from the outset.
Absolutely. That foundational dualism is one of the key characteristics of Plutarch's whole philosophical architecture. Yeah. But to kind of bridge this gap between these 2 principles, he introduces 2 mediating entities. So on the one hand, the indefinite dyad operates through something that he calls a non-rational cosmic soul, and God operates through a rational cosmic soul.
So is it one soul with 2 aspects, or are we actually talking about 2 distinct souls here?
It's the same cosmic soul, but it undergoes a kind of transformation.
Right.
So Plutarch argues that this soul initially, begins as non-rational.
Okay.
It's associated with the dyad.
Right.
But then it actually becomes rational when God imparts reason or nous to it.
Okay.
And it's that act of God imparting reason that brings order to this chaotic matter.
Okay.
And shifts it from that state of chaotic disorder into the kind of structured universe that we inhabit.
So it's not that creation is out of nothing. It's more like God is bringing this kind of order and intelligibility to something that's pre-existing and chaotic, and he's doing that through this world soul.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that has some, I guess, pretty big implications, right?
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
And one of the brilliant things is that this framework allows Plutarch to resolve this tension in interpreting Plato, where sometimes the soul is described as uncreated, you see that in the Phaedrus, and sometimes as created, which you see in the Timaeus.
Right.
So for Plutarch, the world soul is created, quote unquote, only in the sense that it becomes rational.
Right.
Its fundamental existence as a principle of motion, and change, that's not something that was brought into being at a particular point in time.
Okay. That's a really, I guess, elegant way of harmonizing those seemingly different passages. And you said this also kind of explains the existence of badness as well.
Yeah, so because that world soul is originally linked to this non-rational dyad,
okay,
even after it receives reason from God, there's still this kind of residual irrationality.
Right.
Reason in this view is something that's given to it from the outside, not something that's part of its own nature. And so it's that lingering irrationality that Plutarch sees as the root of badness. So badness isn't something that's part of God's design. It's more like a consequence of the universe's kind of original chaotic ingredients.
So badness isn't a positive creation. It's more like a shadow cast by the universe's,
Yeah.
initial kind of chaotic state. This kind of cosmic struggle between order and disorder, is that something that Plutarch sees playing out in other areas as well?
Absolutely. This fundamental dualism, this interplay between the rational and non-rational, isn't just limited to the cosmic level. Plutarch sees it everywhere. He sees it in the world around us and, most importantly, in us as human beings.
So how does that blueprint, that cosmic blueprint, if you will,
Yeah.
how does that kind of map onto our own being as human beings?
Well, Plutarch sees humans as composed of body, soul, and intellect, which is a direct mirror of the cosmic architecture.
Okay.
And just like the world soul has these rational and non-rational aspects, so too does the human soul. The soul's connection with the body, that's what gives rise to all the kind of non-rational dimensions.
Right.
Think of, things like disorder, vice, these irrational impulses that we all have.
Right.
And conversely, when the soul aligns with the intellect, that's when you see rationality flourish.
Okay.
That's when you have order, virtue, benevolence.
So our inner lives, in a sense, are this kind of microcosm of this larger cosmic drama, this tension.
Exactly.
And that leads into his, I guess, understanding of ethics you were mentioning.
Yes, absolutely. His whole ethical framework is shaped by this view of the soul and its place in the cosmos. He suggests that there are sort of, maybe different levels of ethical life.
Okay.
On a practical level, a political level, or a civic level, virtue is about organizing our lives and our interactions with each other.
Okay.
But he also points towards a more elevated theoretical level,
Right.
where the intellect takes the lead and we're guided more towards knowledge, especially towards the contemplation of the forms and the intelligible realm.
Okay. Before we delve into the specifics of his thought, though,
Yeah.
can you maybe paint a picture of his intellectual context?
Yeah.
Who was this Ammonius that he studied with in Athens?
Yeah, so Plutarch studies with Ammonius in Athens around, I think, 667 CE, so during Nero's reign in Greece, were absolutely formative for him. We don't actually know a whole lot about Ammonius' school or his teachings, but the evidence we do have suggests that he was very interested in metaphysics, including theology, religion, all things that fascinated Plutarch.
Yeah.
And it seems that Ammonius really tried to bring together Pythagorean elements with an apparatic, that is to say, actively truth-seeking interpretation of Plato.
Yeah.
So from very early on, Plutarch was exposed to this really interesting blend of very specific metaphysical ideas and an open-ended method of inquiry.
So that combination of Pythagoreanism and this commitment to really open investigation seems to have been a pretty significant early influence for him.
Yeah, I think so. And although Plutarch actually became an Athenian citizen, and he did travel quite extensively, his intellectual home was always in Chaironia and nearby Delphi, where, as you mentioned, he served as a priest of Apollo for many, many years. And you see his engagement with the religious traditions of Delphi.
Right.
And he even gives his own philosophical interpretation of those traditions in some of his writing. And then, of course, there's the Moralia.
Yes. His output was vast. I mean, the Moralia covers a mind-boggling range of philosophical topics.
It does. The ancient catalog, the Lampius catalog, lists over 200 works that are attributed to Plutarch.
Wow.
And these are divided into, broadly speaking, his historical biographical lives and then his philosophical works.
Right.
And it's the latter, the Moralia, that cover this huge, this vast range of topics. It's not just ethics. It's psychology, natural philosophy, theology, logic, political thought, even music and rhetoric.
He really got around. And he wasn't shy about philosophical debate either, was he? I mean, those critiques of the Stoics and Epicureans are pretty extensive. What do you think fueled that kind of that polemical drive?
Yeah, there were a couple of factors. Firstly, both the early Stoics and the Epicureans were huge critics of Plato.
Okay.
So, for example, the Epicurean Calotes directly attacked many of Plato's key ideas. And secondly, Plutarch felt that, both of these schools were borrowing from Plato quite a lot. They were using Plato to support their own systems, but they weren't acknowledging that, and they were also, criticizing Plato.
Right.
So it's kind of like having your cake and eating it too.
Right. So he saw them as being kind of selective.
Exactly.
In their engagement with Plato, almost misrepresenting his ideas to kind of fit their own agenda.
Yeah, that's basically it.
Right.
So Plutarch's polemics were really an attempt to defend what he thought was the authentic Plato against these, as he saw it, misguided interpretations. And he thought this was super important because Stoicism and Epicureanism were kind of the dominant philosophical forces at the time, largely because they offered these comprehensive ethical frameworks, these, ways of living.
Right.
And Plutarch basically wanted to show that their ethics, these ethical theories, were actually based on some flawed foundations that stemmed from an incomplete or just a distorted grasp of what human nature was and what reality was. And it wasn't just specific doctrines, it was their whole approach to philosophical inquiry.
Right. So he had a problem with how they were going about it in the first place.
Exactly. He was critical of what he saw as their rejection of this aporetic or dialectical spirit of Socrates, which he thought was absolutely essential to Plato.
Okay.
He also really had a problem with their kind of materialistic metaphysics.
Right.
Their rejection of the intelligible realm, so the world of God, the forms, intellects, souls.
Right.
That was fundamental to Platonism as he understood it. And it's actually kind of ironic and I think valuable that his critiques are now a very important resource for understanding the very schools that he disagreed with.
Right.
He preserves fragments of their thought.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating kind of irony there, that his criticisms actually help us understand those schools better.
It is.
So let's shift gears a bit to his theory of knowledge. You mentioned his interest in epistemology. Why was that so important to Plutarch as a Platonist?
Yeah, well, he really thought that a good epistemology, a solid theory of knowledge, was absolutely crucial if you wanted to actually ground Platonism. He was very active in defending the epistemology of these thinkers called the academic skeptics, people like Arcesilaus, Carneades, Philo, against people like Antiochus of Ascalon.
Okay.
And by doing so, he was trying to defend the unity and the continuity of the academy.
Okay.
He was saying, look, there's a single line of thought that runs from Plato to these later skeptics.
Okay, so it's not a radical break or anything. It's a continuous development.
Absolutely. And he argued that Plato's own philosophy already had, both these aporetic and doctrinal elements kind of in tension with one another.
Right.
So the aporetic element, that's all about this ongoing search for truth, that kind of freedom from preconceptions. It's basically the Socratic method.
Right.
And Plutarch was very much in favor of this non-committal questioning attitude.
Okay, but that emphasis on questioning, that didn't mean that he thought you couldn't reach any kind of definitive knowledge.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
He definitely thought that Plato did arrive at some firm conclusions, some doctrines. But the important thing for Plutarch was that you should always maintain this open and critical spirit, even when you're considering those established teachings. And so that's why he champions this epistemology that really tries to integrate the suspension of judgment with the possibility of genuine knowledge.
Right.
He saw figures like Socrates and his own mentor, Ammonius, as kind of embodying that balance. And he really tried to redefine what it meant to be, quote unquote, an academic philosopher at the time. He really wanted to get rid of this idea that being an academic meant you were just rigidly committed to skepticism. He felt like the practice of suspending judgment, that was a very long-standing, kind of methodological tool that was used by many distinguished ancient philosophers.
Right.
And so he thought that a true academic actually appreciates both the Socratic method of inquiry, but also the doctrines.
Okay, so it's not an either or, it's a both and.
Exactly, yeah.
That idea of suspending judgment not as, some kind of intellectual weakness, but actually as this tool for getting at the truth. How did that work in practice for him?
Yeah, so Plutarch argued that when you suspend judgment, what you're doing is you're avoiding making commitments to opinions that might be flawed.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Because we make commitments. We have opinions based on what we see, what appears to us, but those things can be deceptive.
Right.
And so he actually directly refutes the Stoic idea that suspending judgment will lead to inaction.
Okay.
He says, look, you don't need to have a belief to act, right?
Yeah.
You just need basic perception and natural impulses. So suspending judgment only applies to our opinions, not to the basic stuff that we do in life. But ultimately, he thought it was about safeguarding yourself against error and just really pursuing knowledge in a much more rigorous and discerning way.
So it's not about becoming paralyzed intellectually. It's about clearing away potential obstacles, right, to get to a clearer understanding.
Absolutely. And he saw this as a vital method for scrutinizing the knowledge that we get from the senses, because he knew that the sensible realm, that's the realm of appearances and becoming.
Right.
That can't give you perfect knowledge of what's true, what's stable. So for him, the deeper understanding, that comes from attending to the intelligible realm.
So how do we actually get access to that intelligible realm?
Yeah.
What's the mechanism of knowing for Plutarch?
Yeah. So he says, look, there's a fundamental difference between sensible knowledge, the knowledge we get through the senses, and then intelligible knowledge.
Okay.
And he associates, different faculties with this. So, sensible knowledge, that's through perception. But intelligible knowledge, that's the nous, the intellect. And for Plutarch, the intellect is not actually part of the embodied soul. It's something external. It's this kind of, cosmic intelligence.
Okay.
And individual souls, we can participate in that.
Right.
And this intellect, the nous, it's equipped with these things called enoi, these kind of fundamental concepts, which are basically our grasp of the forms.
Right.
And it's through the intellect that the soul can engage in amnesis. And that's the process of recollection.
Okay.
That famous Platonic idea that we have this knowledge that we've forgotten that we need to recall.
Right. It's like when you suddenly remember something you thought you had completely forgotten, but it was there all along.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for Plutarch, he saw that as a kind of a glimpse into this knowledge that we have through our intellect's connection to the forms.
So sensory experience is more like belief or conjecture, whereas intellectual apprehension, that's actually getting at the truth of things.
That's exactly it. That's the hierarchy that he sets up. So sensory, quote unquote, knowledge, it remains at the level of pistis, belief, and aikasia, conjecture.
Okay.
But genuine knowledge is about the intelligibles, the forms.
Right.
And actually, it can even give us insights into the divine realm.
Wow.
And he thought that, this deeper level of understanding becomes possible when the soul is free to actually turn inwards.
Okay.
Towards these invisible realities.
So how does suspending judgment actually help us with that?
Well, Plutarch didn't think that there was a conflict between those two. In fact, he argued that suspending judgment is actually what clears the ground for knowledge, because you're setting aside doxa, which is just mere opinion, and philosophia, which is this kind of self-love that can cloud our judgment. And this process, it involves rigorous self-examination.
Okay.
It's like purifying the soul. Right. It's a lot like Socrates' method of Elenchus. Right. Which is about refuting and kind of getting rid of these false beliefs.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So by questioning our assumptions, we kind of create that space for these deeper insights. And it sounds like he put this into practice. He didn't just talk about it abstractly.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So in his treatise on the principle of cold, he actually defends the necessity of suspending judgment as the proper philosophical method.
Okay.
And more generally, he argues that if you really want to understand natural phenomena, you've got to go beyond just observing the material causes. You have to look for those higher, those intelligible, those first causes.
Yeah.
And those are the forms.
Right.
And ultimately God.
Okay.
And for him, that's what makes a true philosopher.
Right.
Someone who doesn't just study the physical world,
right,
but looks for this metaphysical dimension.
It's fascinating. Even when he considers this divine realm, this realm that's so far beyond human comprehension, he still advocates for this posture of suspended judgment, of inquiry as the way to go. It's both intellectually honest and kind of pious.
Absolutely.
So let's move into the kind of heart of his system then. That literal interpretation of the Timaeus, that seems to be the foundation.
Yeah.
What do you think was behind this insistence on reading it that way?
Yeah, Plutarch was very adamant that the cosmogony in the Timaeus, that's the account of the origin of the universe, should be taken literally.
Okay.
He was saying, no, the world did have a beginning in time.
Wow.
And this actually put him in opposition to many Platonists of his time because they favored a more metaphorical or allegorical interpretation.
Okay.
They saw creation as this kind of ongoing eternal process rather than an event in time.
Okay.
But Plutarch felt this literal interpretation was necessary to uphold the idea that the soul is prior to the body.
Okay.
And that it's what initiates all motion and change.
Right. So that goes back to that thorny question of the soul being both created and uncreated, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. He saw it as a way to address that apparent contradiction. And he also thought it was important for understanding the soul's nature as this blend of, something indivisible, which he associates with the intellect, and something divisible, which he sees as this pre-cosmic, this non-rational soul.
Okay.
And he talks about this at length in treatises like, on the generation of the soul and the Timaeus, and on Isis and Osiris.
Right.
These are some of his key works.
Yeah.
But yeah, those two eternal and uncreated principles, God and the indefinite dyad, that's a bold dualism.
It is. So how did he philosophically justify positing these two ultimate realities?
Well, Plutarch, he envisions this cosmos that's ordered,
Yeah.
right? But it came into being through God, the demiurge, acting upon this pre-existing disorderly matter. And that matter was already being animated by this disordered world soul. And he reasoned that God alone, as the principle of order and goodness, couldn't account for that initial disorder and the potential for badness.
Right.
And that's what led him to say, well, we need a second co-eternal principle.
Okay.
And so on the one hand, you have God, the monad, the one, the good, the source of order, intelligibility, stability. And on the other hand, you have the indefinite dyad, which is non-being. It's multiplicity, it's indeterminacy, disorder, irrationality.
Okay.
And he traces these concepts back to the Pythagoreans.
Right.
He even sees echoes of them in Plato's Philebus as the limited and the unlimited.
So it's like this ongoing tension at the very heart of reality.
Yeah.
Between these forces, right, of order and disorder.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even though God is the one who ultimately establishes order, that order is always challenged, in a sense, by this underlying principle. And it's this dynamic interplay that unfolds through those mediating roles of the rational and non-rational world soul.
Okay.
They're kind of the powers of these two principles.
So what about before the cosmos? Before the universe, as we understand it, came into being, what was that pre-cosmic scenario like for Plutarch?
Well, for Plutarch, that pre-cosmic state was already full of matter.
Okay.
But that matter was animated by this non-rational world soul. And so what you had was this chaotic, undirected motion. It's a kind of formless, incoherent corporeality.
Okay.
He links this idea to the receptacle that Plato describes in the Timaeus.
Right. But the Timaeus itself doesn't really describe this pre-cosmic non-rational soul. Is this Plutarch kind of adding to Plato?
Yeah, you're right.
Okay.
There are some scholars who say he's going beyond the text here.
Okay.
But we have to remember that Plutarch, he was operating under this assumption that all of Plato's mature dialogues kind of presented a unified Platonic view. So he's trying to, find evidence for this in Plato's later work.
Okay.
And he connects it to things like, the disorderly and maleficent soul that's mentioned in Laws X.
Okay.
The principle of limitlessness that's discussed in the Philebus.
Okay.
He even connects it to necessity in Enki, as it appears in the Timaeus. And so, even though these connections might not be so straightforward, what he's really trying to do is build a more complete picture of Plato's system.
Right. It's an interpretive project.
Exactly.
I imagine he also had his own kind of philosophical motivations for positing this pre-cosmic soul. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
Beyond the textual support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, for one thing, the Timaeus itself says that the demiurge doesn't actually create the world's soul from nothing.
Right.
He blends indivisible being, which is linked to intellect, with divisible being, which Plutarch identifies with this non-rational soul. And then, the prevailing idea at the time was that all motion needs a principle of motion. And in Platonism, that's the soul.
Right.
So that pre-cosmic disordered motion, that needs a soul to account for it.
Okay.
And then I think most importantly, Plutarch saw this as a way to kind of maintain the transcendence of God.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
He didn't want to make God directly responsible for the initial disorder. And so having this pre-cosmic soul, that acts as this kind of buffer.
It's that mediating element again.
Exactly.
So creation for him wasn't this simple, instantaneous event. It was a much more complex kind of unfolding of things.
It is, yeah. It's this process.
Yeah.
So the first stage is God imparting his own intelligence and reason, the nous, to this non-rational world soul.
Yeah.
And so that makes it partially rational.
Okay.
And Plutarch even goes so far as to say that the rational world soul is not just a creation separate from God. It's a part of God.
Oh, wow.
It's an efflux or emanation.
Okay.
And as the world soul becomes more like God, through this infusion of reason, its motions become more orderly, matter becomes more stable, and it can then receive the forms. And speaking of the forms, they play a really interesting role in all of this. Where do they fit in this whole drama?
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty intricate system.
Yeah, it is actually a bit complex and a bit obscure because he talks about this in some treatises that we've actually lost.
Okay.
But we can actually look at the myth of Isis and Osiris, which he recounts in this work on Isis and Osiris,
Oh.
to get an idea of what he might have been thinking.
Right.
So in that myth, you often see Osiris interpreted as this divine intellect, this principle of goodness.
Right.
Isis is more like this receptive principle, kind of like the receptacle or world soul.
Okay.
And the story is that Osiris implants shapes and forms, morphous chi ideas, into Isis, which eventually results in the birth of Horus, who represents the ordered cosmos. And so what this suggests is that Plutarch probably thought that the forms exist within the divine intellect, maybe even in God himself, which was a pretty common view among later Platonists. But it wasn't as straightforward as just saying the forms are God's thoughts, right?
Right. Yeah.
There's some subtlety there.
Yeah.
So some scholars have said that maybe Plutarch located the forms not directly within the intellect of God, because that's utterly simple, but perhaps in the soul of the divine creator.
Okay.
And that aligns with the views of later Platonists like Atticus, who followed Plutarch's interpretation of the Timaeus.
Okay.
And the reason they might have wanted to do this was to preserve that absolute simplicity of God, the highest intellect.
Right.
But unfortunately, Plutarch doesn't actually spell this out in his surviving writings. But we can see in his discussions of the Timaeus that he talks about the receptacle, and he talks about Genesis.
Okay.
And he identifies Genesis with this non-rational soul and being with this kind of unified realm that encompasses both the divine intellect and the forms.
Okay. So this tension, this constant tension between good and bad, between order and disorder, it seems to really raise these questions about fate and free will. Expert.